Imagine this. The most powerful office in the world reaches once again for its oldest weapon tariffs, not against luxuries, not against excess, but against the lifelines of a continent. Gold that holds up national budgets, cotton and cocoa that keep millions of families alive, oil that lights villages and powers cities. Washington thought it was a familiar game squeeze, Africa remind her of her place, and wait for leaders to bow their heads. But this time the silence broke differently. A single young leader dismissed by many as temporary stood tall before the storm. Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier turned statesman, looked at the ultimatum and said 9 words that shook the world: Africa is done kneeling. Those words were not just defiance. They were a line in the sand, a declaration that dignity cannot be priced in dollars or tariffs. The impact was immediate. Social media lit up, village radios repeated his words, and in the marketplaces of Accra, Lagos, and Ouagadougou, people whispered the same thought: if Burkina Faso can say no, what about us? Analysts in New York and Brussels called it reckless. But ordinary citizens across Africa called it revolutionary. And here is where the story turns to you. For decades, Americans have been told that tariffs are just policy, just numbers in a ledger. But ask yourself what happens when those numbers are aimed like weapons at people's food, their farms, their schools, and what happens when, for the first time in generations, a leader refuses to bend. This is not just a story about trade. It is about sovereignty, dignity, and whether Africa will remain chained to borrowed power or finally stand on its own. So we must ask, could this be the dawn of a new chapter in global history? Please share if you feel that you are among the first to know and support President Ibrahim Traoré's stand. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. It began quietly, as these things often do. In the markets of Bobo Dioulasso, women selling tomatoes and yams noticed prices creeping upward. In the gold mines of the Sahel, workers whispered that exports were slowing, shipments being held up at customs. On the docks of Abidjan and Lagos, ships waited for clearance, but rumors spread of new tariffs from Washington. For ordinary people, it felt like another invisible hand tightening its grip on their daily lives. Tariffs. To many Americans, they appear as technical numbers: 15% here, 20% there, mere percentages scribbled in trade reports. But in Africa, those percentages are not abstract. A 15% tariff on textiles meant $1.2 billion stripped from export earnings. A levy on cocoa meant over 3 million farmers across West Africa could lose their livelihood. Cotton growers in Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Mali feared entire harvests would rot unsold. And behind every statistic was a family, a classroom, a meal that might not be there tomorrow. Washington's strategy was clear. When diplomacy falters, when persuasion fails, there is always the old playbook: use economics as a weapon. Tariffs were designed not to punish luxury goods, but to strike at the backbone of African economies: gold, cotton, cocoa, staple foods. Make the essentials costly, weaken negotiating power, and wait for leaders to beg for relief. It was a tactic as old as empire, as calculated as divide and rule. But then came the moment no one expected. Instead of quiet compliance, instead of hushed apologies, one leader stepped forward. Standing before his people and the world, Captain Ibrahim Traoré rejected the ultimatum outright. No compromise, no hesitation. To him, tariffs were nothing more than blackmail disguised as economics. His words cut like a blade through decades of silence: Africa is done kneeling. The declaration was electric. In Ouagadougou, young students cheered, waving makeshift flags in the streets. In Bamako and Niamey, families listening to late-night radio repeated his words as if they were a prayer. For the first time in decades, a leader had not just resisted, but refused, outright, transforming numbers on paper into symbols of defiance. Washington expected fear. Instead, it was met with resistance. Analysts estimated that the tariffs could strip Africa of $600 million annually in exports. But in that moment, those numbers no longer defined the conversation. What mattered was dignity. What mattered was that a landlocked nation with a GDP smaller than some U.S. states had dared to look the White House in the eye and say no. Global headlines captured the shock. Was this a humiliation for President Trump, being openly challenged by a country so often dismissed as peripheral? Or was it the birth of a new era where small nations refused to sell dignity for survival? The debate raged in television studios, but in the streets of Africa the meaning was clear. This was about sovereignty, about refusing to bow to threats disguised as trade policy. That night in Ouagadougou, a mural appeared on a university wall. It showed a soldier's silhouette standing against a storm with words in bold paint, "We will not kneel." It was not just art, it was a signal. Across the continent, people felt something shift. For once, fear had not dictated the response. Courage had. Thus, the story of tariffs stopped being about percentages. It became a story about a continent reclaiming its voice. A single act of defiance by a 36-year-old soldier president turned what Washington intended as economic pressure into political theater and ignited a conversation far larger than the tariffs themselves. The ultimatum was supposed to corner Burkina Faso. Instead, it ignited a fire across an entire continent. Within just 72 hours of Traoré's declaration, the silence of African capitals broke into a chorus of unity. 34 nations rallied behind him, activating emergency agreements that allowed trade to be rerouted, reserves to be pooled, and vital supply chains to be shielded. What Washington expected to fracture became the very proof of cohesion. The numbers tell a story as dramatic as the politics. Analysts estimated that by consolidating supply lines from cocoa fields in West Africa to textile hubs in East Africa, African states protected nearly $18.6 billion in intercontinental trade flows. Jobs were saved, currencies stabilized, and the tariffs that were designed to divide ended up pushing Africa closer together. Instead of collapse, there was resilience. Instead of begging, there was bargaining power. The scene on the ground matched the statistics. In Accra, flags waved in public squares as citizens celebrated the African Union's speed of response. In Addis Ababa, young people gathered outside AU headquarters chanting, "Unity is our shield." In Ouagadougou itself, crowds poured into the streets, not in protest, but in celebration, carrying portraits of Traoré painted with bold strokes, his face framed by the words, "Sovereignty is not for sale." And the world noticed. Markets in New York and Chicago trembled as cocoa futures jumped 4%, cotton rose 3%, and gold contracts spiked. For Wall Street traders, it was volatility. For Africans, it was vindication. The message was unmistakable. Africa was no longer predictable terrain to be bent at will. Global media scrambled to frame the moment. In Washington, commentators asked how a landlocked country with a GDP smaller than Vermont could shake the White House. In Paris, editorialists lamented the loss of French leverage, noting that old colonial tactics of divide and rule had met their match. In Beijing and Moscow, the reaction was almost celebratory proof that the multipolar order they had championed was no longer theoretical, but alive in African defiance. The turning point was more than diplomatic. It was psychological. For decades, fear had been the silent currency of international politics. Tariffs, sanctions, and debt strings worked because small nations believed they had no alternative. But Traoré's defiance cracked that illusion. If Burkina Faso could refuse and survive, why not Nigeria with its oil contracts? Why not South Africa with its BRICS leverage? Why not Kenya with its agricultural backbone? The dominoes began to fall. In Johannesburg, students painted murals of Traoré with the phrase, "Courage is contagious." In Nairobi, lawmakers openly debated redirecting tea and coffee exports toward Asian and Gulf markets. In Lagos, Nigerian economists questioned why their nation should continue to ship crude under contracts that bled billions while importing refined petroleum at inflated prices. Fear was being replaced with curiosity, and curiosity quickly turned into action. Across the Atlantic, the ripple reached Latin America. Mexican commentators recalled Trump's earlier tariff battles and admitted that Africa had exposed the bluff. In Brazil, intellectuals described Burkina Faso as a laboratory of courage, proof that diversification was no longer a dream but a necessity. Even in Southeast Asia, whispers grew louder. If a small, landlocked African state could defy the system, why couldn't they? In this way, what began as a technical dispute over percentages became a global rupture. The arrogance of treating access to markets as a leash had been laid bare, and in its place rose something Washington never intended: a sense of solidarity, not just in Africa, but across the global South. The climax was not only in the numbers, not even in the markets, but in the hearts of ordinary people. In villages where radios crackled with the news, elders told children, "Remember this day, the day fear broke." And on social media, hashtags from Dakar to Dar es Salaam carried a single message: Africa does not kneel. The storm of tariffs had been unleashed, but instead of submission, the response thundered back with defiance, unity, and the unmistakable realization that the old order was crumbling before the world's eyes. The defiance of tariffs was not just a headline, it became a policy carved into the daily lives of Burkina Faso's people. Almost overnight, the government in Ouagadougou pivoted from waiting on exemptions to building resilience. Traoré's words, "Africa is done kneeling," were matched by actions that touched farms, factories, and the very streets of the capital. The first wave of reforms was economic. Gold mines once managed by multinationals were brought under national authority. Revenues that had long disappeared into offshore accounts now reinforced local budgets funding schools and clinics. Agricultural programs were launched with urgency irrigation systems, seed distribution, and new storage facilities promised to transform Burkina Faso from an importer of staples into a food-secure nation. Even as tariffs threatened to slash external revenue, fiscal discipline tightened. Regional economists estimated that by reallocating funds and cutting foreign drains, the government saved nearly $1.2 billion annually, money redirected into the pockets of its own people. For ordinary citizens, the changes were visible. In Ouagadougou's neighborhoods, construction of new grain silos began within weeks. In rural villages, cooperatives received seed packages stamped with the national crest rather than foreign logos. Farmers spoke with cautious pride, "For once we are planting for ourselves, not for someone else's table." It was not just policy, it was dignity, taking physical form. Politically, the ripple was equally dramatic. Within weeks of rejecting Washington's ultimatum, Traoré ordered the closure of foreign military bases long viewed as symbols of dependency. Soldiers once under outside command now returned to national duty, a visible reminder that sovereignty meant controlling not just land, but security. This move sent shockwaves through the region. Critics called it reckless. Supporters hailed it as liberation. But for the Burkinabe public, it was proof that defiance in words was being matched by defiance in deeds. The symbolism mattered. In a country where memories of colonial subjugation run deep, the sight of national flags replacing foreign emblems on bases and mines stirred emotions stronger than any speech. Young people painted walls with slogans like "Sovereignty feeds us" and "Dignity is security." The narrative shifted from survival under pressure to strength through independence. Internationally, these decisions carried weight. Washington's sanctions had once rattled giants, forcing China, Mexico, and Europe into drawn-out negotiations. Yet here was a small African state refusing to bow and instead accelerating reforms. Commentators in global media began asking whether tariffs were losing their sting, not because they were unfair, but because they were outdated. Domestically, Traoré's approval surged. Opposition figures who once doubted his legitimacy now struggled to criticize a leader whose policies were filling granaries and reclaiming resources. To many, he ceased being just a transitional soldier president. He became the embodiment of a generational demand sovereignty is not negotiable. Still, the path was not without tension. Businesses tied to Western contracts expressed fear of short-term losses. Civil servants worried about tighter budgets. Yet the larger sentiment outweighed the doubts. Across Burkina Faso, the consensus was clear: better to endure sacrifice now than to remain forever chained. Thus, the rejection of tariffs reshaped not only economics, but politics. It redefined the relationship between state and citizen, between government and resource, between Africa and the West. By standing firm, Burkina Faso had shown that sovereignty is not a line in a constitution, it is lived in the choices a nation makes, even under pressure. From Washington's perspective, the rejection of tariffs was supposed to be unthinkable. For decades, U.S. administrations had relied on economic pressure as a lever of control. Tariffs were seen as a quiet weapon: apply a few percentage points, shake the markets, and wait for small nations to bend. That formula worked on China, Mexico, and even Brussels. But when applied to Africa in 2025, it misfired. In the White House, commentators framed Traoré's defiance as a humiliation for President Trump. How could the leader of a landlocked country with a GDP smaller than many American states openly challenge Washington? Was this a sign of weakness in U.S. global influence, or simply an outlier born of youthful rashness? Cable news debated endlessly, but the image of an African president staring down the tariff ultimatum lingered in the minds of viewers around the world. On Wall Street, the shock was financial. Cocoa futures surged by 5%, cotton indices climbed 3%, and gold contracts spiked as traders recalibrated risk. For investors, it was volatility. For Africa, it was leverage. Analysts quietly admitted that Africa's diversification toward Asia, Latin America, and intracontinental trade had reduced U.S. power to dictate terms. The message was sobering. The dollar was no longer the only gatekeeper. In Europe, the reaction was mixed. Officially, Brussels echoed Washington's call for restraint, but privately, European companies increased their purchases of African exports, unwilling to lose ground in a region destined to drive global growth. To them, Africa was not a battlefield for sanctions, but a marketplace of opportunity. The quiet divergence between US and EU strategies revealed a deeper truth. Even Western allies were no longer unified in their approach. Elsewhere, the picture was far clearer. Beijing stepped in with new mineral purchase agreements and currency swap lines that freed African banks from reliance on the US dollar. Moscow announced direct gold purchases at above-market rates, pairing trade with security cooperation. New Delhi signed billion-dollar import deals for grains and cotton, linking Africa to its pharmaceutical exports in return. Brazil expanded agricultural exchanges, while even Gulf states offered contracts for African produce. What Washington intended as isolation had instead accelerated Africa's integration into a multipolar world. The symbolic impact was profound. Across the global South, nations long accustomed to fearing tariffs and sanctions began to see Burkina Faso as proof that resistance was not suicide, but survival. In Latin America, commentators recalled past trade battles and admitted Africa had revealed the bluff. In Southeast Asia, policymakers quietly studied how a small, landlocked state had turned economic pressure into opportunity. The lesson was spreading dependency is not destiny. For the United States, the deeper concern was not just Burkina Faso, but the precedent. If one nation could defy tariffs and survive, what would stop others from doing the same? Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, even beyond Africa, partners in Latin America and Asia might begin to question whether Washington's economic tools carried the same fear they once did. Tariffs, once a symbol of American leverage, risked becoming a reminder of its declining reach. In this light, Traoré's 9 words, "Africa is done kneeling," resonated not just in Ouagadougou, but in parliaments, stock exchanges, and boardrooms around the globe. They forced the world to confront a new reality. The balance of power was shifting, and the old instruments of control were losing their edge. In the end, this story was never just about tariffs. It was about something deeper, the collapse of fear. For decades, nations across the global South lived under the assumption that resistance was impossible. The United States imposed tariffs, and governments adjusted their budgets. France demanded access to resources, and leaders complied. The IMF tightened debt conditions, and ministers signed with reluctance. Fear was the silent chain that bound continents. But Burkina Faso shattered that chain. With one sentence, "Africa is done kneeling," Ibrahim Traoré transformed the conversation from percentages and trade codes into dignity and sovereignty. What Washington intended as punishment became the spark of resilience. What was meant to divide instead ignited unity. And what had long been dismissed as impossible suddenly appeared inevitable, Africa refusing to kneel, not in theory, but in practice. The implications stretch far beyond Ouagadougou. If one small landlocked nation can withstand pressure and even grow stronger, what happens when an entire continent embraces the same path? What happens if Africa's unity ceases to be reactive and becomes the norm? And perhaps most unsettling for Washington, what happens when other regions, Latin America, Southeast Asia, even parts of Europe, begin to draw the same lessons? This moment should not be romanticized. The path ahead will be difficult. Economic sacrifices are real. Political risks remain. And unity is never guaranteed. Yet the principle has been established: sovereignty is no longer negotiable. Tariffs, sanctions, and ultimatums have lost their inevitability. The balance of power in global trade is shifting, and Africa is stepping into that new century not as a subject, but as a player. For Americans, especially those who lived through decades of Cold War headlines and endless trade disputes, this may feel unsettling, but perhaps it is also clarifying. For the first time in generations, Africa is writing its own story. And whether one agrees or disagrees with Traoré's defiance, one thing is certain: history has been made. So we leave you with the question: do you believe this is the dawn of Africa's economic independence, or just another passing moment in a long struggle? Can leaders like Ibrahim Traoré truly sustain reform, or will new pressures test their resolve? Please share if you feel you are among the first to witness and support this turning point. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. Because one day when history asks who saw the dawn of a new Africa, your voice may be part of the answer.